Alrighty, let's go ahead and get started just for the sake of time. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining today. My name is Lauren Lecy, and I am the Manager of Grants and Research Projects at the National Endowment for Financial Education. We're really excited to have Dr. Joseph de la Torre Dwyer here today from Knology to present his work supported by NEFE. In 2019, NEFE awarded a grant to Knology to explore investment in financial education at the state level across the US. While many states have implemented financial education mandates in K-12 schools, there was very little data on the actual investments in these efforts from state entities and nonprofit organizations. So Knology created an open access database in our package, combining data from the Survey for Household Economics and Decision-Making, as well as a mapping tool to represent changes in financial education investments and financial health outcomes from 2001 to 2019. To further utilize these new tools, NEFE and Knology launched a fellowship program for emerging scholars to contribute to the next wave of research using the database and mapping tool. Today, we'll hear from Dr. Dwyer about his work on the database and mapping tool, but we hope you can join us later this month and early next year to hear from the fellows themselves about their individual projects. You may have already received emails from us about those sessions, but I will drop links for those in the chat towards the end of the webinar. We plan to save about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the webinar for Q&A and ask that you save questions until then. When the time comes, the best ways to ask a question are to either raise your hand virtually through Zoom, and the host will unmute you to ask your question directly to the presenters. We will unmute folks in the order that we received raised hands. Alternatively, you can also type questions into the chat box, and we will answer those in the order that they are received. Please refrain from using the chat feature before then, just to not distract our presenters. I will also drop a link to the chat to a link in the chat to a short survey at the end of the Q&A time. This is meant to provide feedback on the webinar today, and we really value your thoughts and suggestions. It should take no more than 3 minutes to complete, and we really appreciate you doing so. And I think that might be it. If you run into any issues, I believe you can chat me directly. But without further ado, I'll hand it over to Joseph.
Okay, thank you so much, Lauren, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to all of our attendees today for taking the time to join us. So I'm planning to discuss this NEFE Knology financial education database that Lauren mentioned in her introduction. I want to talk a little bit about some of the motivation for that, spend a lot more time talking about the content and what you can find in there and where you can find it and how to best make use of it. And I'll talk just a little bit at the end, sort of sharing, as Lauren mentioned, we were running this fellowship during the summer and just kind of wrapping up now, and sharing some of what those folks were able to make use of without, of course, stealing any of their thunder, but really looking forward to seeing what they do in the webinars and in the future. Already the work coming out of that looks really great. So let me start moving in with some slides here. Let's see. Great. Okay. So just very quickly about me. I was a Knology researcher from 2018 to 2020, and am currently affiliated with the organization as a Knology Research Fellow. The bulk of this work was happening, as Lauren mentioned, in 2020. I also had the privilege to be able to write and finish and publish my book, Chance, Merit, and Economic Inequality, while I was working at Knology. And I've been working in a non-academic position since 2021, so it's really lovely to see that this project still has such great legs and is getting used so well. So let me jump to that. the motivation here. So we had, of course, in the early 2000s, maybe especially sort of the 2010s, in response to the Great Recession, this explosion in financial education mandates. And we thought that there was also simultaneously a gap. What resources were actually being spent? Something that said not just that there was a mandate in the state, but trying to paint a more finely grained picture of what was actually happening. Could two states that had a mandate be doing things differently? Could a state that did not have a mandate be nonetheless reaching a large number of their students with a quite high quality financial education course? We were also noting that we had shed surveys, so surveys of household economics and decision making, which had started in 2013 and had been just building up more and more years with a nice large N size, over 10,000 in each of those surveys, and really reaching specifically in sort of their purpose, reaching toward low and moderate income respondents who were extra weighted, as well as themes and topics that were concerned with the lives of low and moderate income Americans as well. And we thought that feels like a nice match for the purpose of financial education mandates. Might be trying to help people across the income scale, but maybe with a particular focus at the low and moderate income. And we had in our heads that in an ideal world, we could get a kind of almost a cost benefit analysis out of this, where we're able to say, listen, this state on average was able to treat this number of students with this depth of a program or this depth of a financial education intervention. And here's what that turned into. Using some of those shed survey questions, were they able to handle a $400 unexpected expense? Were they feeling more financially fragile, or were they having trouble affording healthcare? Those sort of nice concrete things, getting a little bit of a sense of what was the impact at a much more detailed level, besides just the really, again, kind of foundational and wonderful work of all these financial education mandates, but trying to take that one step further. Okay, so how were we thinking about doing this? We started with an anchor on the details of financial education requirements. So at the Brookings Institute, we had a really nice, I believe it was a 2017, 2018 product from them, where they were going through each and every state and trying to say, here is what the financial education requirement looks like in all of these states, as well as here is the source for our data for each of these states. And so for us, a lot of those sources were accessible online. And we thought this is a perfect anchor to sort of pitch ourselves into a state like Oregon or a state like North Dakota, whatever it might be, to start then following those threads and that trail backwards in time. So we would be using things either coming out of state legislatures or state boards of education to figure out, okay, if it looked like this in 2017, what did it look like in 2016 or 15 or 14, the last time that it might have changed prior to that. And then we were counting these financial literacy requirements as a fraction of mandatory or elective courses. Now, one thing that we ended up doing here was saying, we have really nice standards, for example, from Jumpstart, which could be used by many, many states. And we could see, even if you didn't have a mandatory course, or even if this was going all the way back to 2003, let's say, we could still identify which of the standards in your course in Oregon looked like they were matching up with one of the many, many, many Jumpstart standards. So as a way for us to sort of pin against something to say, does this count as financial education or a financial literacy standard? The data that we've put together now is the biggest, the kind of core of it, I should say, is 2001 to 2019. There's a little bit, some things are going up to 2021, some things are going back into the 1990s, but that's where the core of the data is strongest, where you get the most states that we're able to sort of see simultaneously. We also said we don't want to just look at classrooms and try to get a sense of, okay, so in 2006 in North Dakota, we looked and we saw that they had a course that was just an elective, but it looked like of the 20 standards that they offered in that elective, that 12 of them were rayed out of the Jumpstart set of standards. And so we could say 12 over 20 could give us a fraction of how much of that course might we want to call a financial education or a financial literacy treatment. We wanted to also go beyond the classroom. We thought this was another valuable addition of our work, was to look at what were nonprofits doing in those states at the same time. Now, part of this came from thinking, well, it may be that there is some interaction between the two segments or the two sectors, where a legislature that saw that they had a really strong set of nonprofits who were running programs where they were meeting thousands of elementary school kids, thousands of middle school kids, hundreds of thousands of high schoolers every year, that they might have felt we don't need to make a mandate, or they might say we don't need to really bother ourselves with ensuring that if there is some financial education or financial literacy, or even the economics course for all that, that there's a big financial literacy or financial education component there that we, the legislature, are getting involved in. And so we thought maybe there's some interaction there where when one is strong, the other says, great, I don't need to worry about it. And when one is weak, the other says, I should be stepping in here. And so we conducted some interviews with some state leaders. Specifically, we were able to make a really nice partnership, and this was great. NEFE and the Council for Economic Education were able to work together on this. And so the Council for Economic Education was able to offer us some insight into IRS 990s for different states' CEE local chapters across this big 20-year time horizon. That gave us what I'll call sort of the inside view. Council for Economic Education is, of course, not representing all of what nonprofits might be doing in this space, but it gave us a good idea because they are a core player in this space. And then secondly, we wanted to complement that with what I'll call the outside view, where we're saying we had this data set from the National Center for Charitable Statistics, And so this was letting us say, we're going to use the various codes that are assigned in that database to say, let's try to identify how many of these organizations might be related to financial literacy or financial education, and get a sense of what that spending looks like. So we have spending directly off the 990s from one of the biggest and most central organizations in financial education, Council for Economic Education. And we also have this outside view trying to capture what's going on in the whole state, where it's looking at data that's not so finely grained. We don't know if someone is in there and they have a budget of X, how much of that budget is actually going to financial education, financial literacy. But nonetheless, it gave us that kind of outside view. So the inside outside view, we hope, was going to offer a new angle. We've got both inside the classroom, and we've got what are nonprofits doing in the States. Turning now toward going a little bit more in depth here with the SHED, the Survey for Household Economics and Decision Making, thinking about the outcomes that people might want to use as a connection. Say, we saw intervention X, what do we see on outcome Y? And we thought not everybody's going to want to use the SHED, and there's no requirement. Anyone who finds our project online can take the data and mix it and match it any way they want. But we've put together a whole suite, a whole ecosystem of products that can work together pretty nicely. But of course, if you just want to use our SHED products, connect it to a different intervention, great. If you want to use our intervention products, but connect it to a different data set on the outcome side, great. Nonetheless, SHED had some really interesting top-line questions on economic outcomes. They're covering questions on respondents' knowledge, respondents' behavior, respondents' subjective experience. And as I said before, there's that strong focus written right into their mission, and that's a niche within the world of surveys that they wanted to fill, was to have an extra focus on the experiences and the challenges faced by low and moderate income Americans. As I said before, a presumable, not necessary, but a presumable core target for the benefits of financial literacy that legislatures and others might have been thinking of as they wrote these mandates. And it had this really nice size. So over 10,000 a year since 2017. We did this project in 2020, as I was saying. And so we were working at the beginning of the project with 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. And because we were just working with this fellowship, who you're going to hear over the next few weeks and in the early next year, some of the great work that they've been able to do with this kind of initial project, is that we've expanded that and said, well, 2020 and 2021, we've now made sure that some of our products that we had already put out that went up to 2019 now extend even farther. So we're really covering, even still, even though this original grant is a couple of years old, really making sure that we're covering everything that the SHED has been doing from its inception up until today. So what did we do with all of this? So we have multiple well-documented new perspectives on these financial education activities and spending directed at primary and secondary students from 2001 to 2017. I'll bump that up, as I said before, I think to 2019. We have, for example, 4 scales of multi-year SHED items. So I'll talk about this a little bit later, but we've put together some scales, and you'll be able to find in our code online as well ways to see the various reliability and other statistics that you want about those scales. But scales to do a little bit of the work in case people want to use that. They don't have to put it all together themselves. We've got a website that I'll be talking about a little bit later. We've got a interactive map I'll be talking about a little bit later as well. We had put a manuscript into the Journal of Consumer Policy. So we have a lot of different things going on, but let me start get a little bit more into the weeds here. So one thing, of course, we've been trying to be pretty transparent throughout the project. So that's part of why we think we are sort of sharing everything in such a nice, easy to digest way, as we're trying to put as much as we can out there, but also want to share that in a similar vein, some caveats. So there are, of course, some gaps, both in the classroom data and in the nonprofit data. This work is very likely missing some important local or regional players. So when we were talking with people were wondering, hey, is it, it might be that in this state, 4-H is really big, or Girl Scouts is doing a really awesome program. But because you're not looking at them as a primarily finance or economic related organization, you might be missing them. We're, of course, also ignoring and missing variation at the school district or the local level. So this was part of why we wanted to go one extra layer past the mandates, was to say, well, can we figure out in a little bit of a more nuanced way what's the actual depth of this mandate here in terms of course time and course quality, if we're using this set of standards as a benchmark. Of course, Carly Urban and colleagues have done some foundational work that we're relying on pretty heavily here, but they also have done some really nice stuff where they're looking at the school district or the local level, trying to get a sense of variation within a state. So that's something that we are not picking up on here. We also don't have any teacher training data. So we, again, in talking with people about this project before we launched into it and trying to make some design decisions at the front of it, people were wondering if that was possible. And it just wasn't something that we were able to fit into things. We also don't have any post high school financial literacy data. So we may be able to tell you that a 2014 graduate in South Carolina received exposure to some financial literacy standards in grades 4, 5, and 6, in grades 7 and 8, and in grades 9, 10, and 11, 12 at such and such a quote unquote dosage. But then when they left high school and now they're responding to the SHED or whatever other external survey you might be interested in at age 26, we don't know, well, were they running into anything at college? Were they running into anything at their job, for example, that was giving them new skills, maybe some just-in-time assistance with particular decisions about loans or retirement savings that we're not including in this data set and not privy to. And as I said, the SHED set is going to 2019. Now we've expanded that with a product that we're calling our Crosswalk, where we're trying to help other researchers see the similarity between questions across all of the years of the SHED. So a question that started off in 2013 might have had the word overall, comma, XXX in it, and then they dropped the overall for 2015 going forward. We then have sort of lined up all of that. We've also done the same lining up when different answers were either dropped out. You might have had a subset of how are you paying off your credit cards, and an answer might have dropped out or an answer might have been added in. So we have this really nice, and I have to give all the credit to my colleagues at Knology, for this really nice crosswalk program, crosswalk data set and resource that some of the fellows were definitely able to take advantage of. So at this point, I'm going to shift into describing a little bit of the different data sets and just a very, very quick, almost just this one-liner to share with all of you who are enjoying the webinar now and might be reviewing the webinar at a later date, get a quick sense for what the data sets are, where would I go if I'm diving into this for the first time, because what do they actually mean? And then later I'm going to go through and show you a little bit more in an even more concrete fashion how you might go about accessing that and what it looks like and what are some of the fun kind of advantages and features of what we've put together for you. So there's a data set that we were calling the NCCS-AY, where that's standing for the National Center for Charitable Statistics all years. This is, as I was saying, that kind of outside view, total financial education expenses among nonprofits across a number of years. And so, as I said before, we're trying to take a guess at looking at the codes inside that data, who is a financial education organization, and then adding up their expenses, figuring out which state they're operating in, etc. So this is the place to go for that outside view. We have a data set called Other FinEd Activities. This would be giving you kind of a rough sketch of the financial education landscape around 2019. So this work was started just at the end of 2019 and mostly through 2020. But of course, you're always looking back a little bit when you're doing research. So that's roughly when that landscape would exist. We have a data set called Public School Spending, which, as I'm trying to lay out at the bottom here, is kind of drawing on three other data sets that we'll want to talk about. So we've got the state year FinEd academic standards data set, the state year econ demog data set, and the state public schools data set 2017. And all of those are being drawn upon in order to construct the public school spending data set. Some interesting things that you might want to find in this data set are, so what is the mean total time or the course years of exposure that a student who graduated in 2014 was likely to have been exposed to in state X. We also have one way that you might measure that in money, the spending course credits per student variable. There are, of course, lots of different decisions you could take here. So I sort of say on one end of things, you might want to say that if a teacher comes in with content for students that's financial education and they're teaching that, you might think of that more as a broadcast model. And so it may be that if there is a value to that teaching, that every kid is receiving that particular number, let's say $20 or $5,000 worth of teacher time. On the other hand, you might think that part of it is broadcast in that way, but that other parts need to be divided up so that if there were larger numbers of students in the classroom or something like that, you might want to adjust. But nonetheless, I think within our data set, that's mostly just going to be a question of scale where you go there. But I do just bring that up in case people want to use that. Is that right now we have that as just divided up. So if there are 30 kids in a classroom, we've taken the value of the teacher's time divided by 30. But of course, no requirement for anyone else to use it in that way. And we have, as I said, and I'll show you later, we have the code where you can see exactly how we're reaching that number, and you yourself can then just very easily adjust that code to do exactly what you would like to do for your research question. We have the State Public Schools 2017 data set with some demographic and some salary information about how many students were in the state, how much are teachers paid. This also has some of Urban's school district level data. The state year econ and demographic data. So we've got demographic and economic data by state and year. We feel like this is going to be for folks. We were sort of thinking of it in terms of doing some difference in difference or event study design. And so we wanted to have some covariates about what was happening in states over the course of those years, so that we could make sure that we could control for that if we wanted to. And we also have included in there some scales of unfair and deceptive practice laws. This is a bit more particular. This was just an idea that I was wondering about, which was, is it possible that the unfair and deceptive practice laws might be doing some of the interesting work? So if you were a legislature and asking students to, or mandating students to do a financial education or a financial literacy course, were you asking them to do that because you wanted to avoid some outcomes that other laws you might have been working on also could have an impact on? And so we wanted to figure out, that was at least a research question, kind of to see how those either interacted, or if the unfair and deceptive practice laws would let you find any association or predict how folks might fare in that state. State year FinEd academic standards. These are the core inputs for the classroom exposure, with also citations and links for where we're finding these standards. The state year FinEd IRS 990 forms. The Council for Economic Education data set is there. The state year FinEd requirements has all the citations and the links for the mandates or the requirements. We also include in there, we have Urban and Schmeiser have the fantastic graduation requirements by state and year data set that is in there, and similarly kind of an updated and slightly different way that Urban has done this, the state high school graduation requirement data. You can find the originals right at the links, of course, as well. So I wanted to just finish up by showing a little bit more specifically what I mean, putting some more concrete details onto that. So I want to talk about our website a little bit. So if you go to our website, you'll see there's kind of two places that I would direct you to first. That is the project website with the R package here, is the reference. And then inside the reference, you've got the various data sets. So that's the first stop to see the data set variables. And then we have a whole bunch of code books as well, which I'll call the second stop for details. So you now figured out which data set you're interested in. The code books is going to give you a whole wealth of information. And so we're trying to make this, again, as easy for other researchers to come by and say, okay, I don't need to build my own code book to get a sense of the distribution of this variable. I don't need to even write my own 1 or 2 line piece of code. You guys have built a whole thing for me. And so if you went to this, this website here, which is just representing our R package, you can first see, how do I cite this? The community section on the right-hand border is telling you if you wanted to contribute. So you might say, I spotted some errors, or I wanted to add an update of a year. That's always possible as well. The licenses, etc. Everything is there to figure out how do you use this product responsibly and enjoy using it as well. If you go to the reference, so reference data sets right at the top, you can see links to each and every one of those that I was just discussing. So the NCCSAY at the top, the other FinEd activities right there with links that will take you to a better description. So what's actually going on in there? If we went to, for example, the state year FinEd academic standards data link, you would have the title up here, a little bit of a detail, how you would bring that up inside of R, and then you get a format. Okay, this is 530 observations, 27 variables, all the variables are listed. So you get a sense of what would I actually be looking at. Now, secondly, you've got the code books. So here, and I'm partly because I couldn't help, so we had elections yesterday across the nation. So one of the variables that is in that economic and demographic data is about state control of the party in various years. And so what you'd be able to see are, okay, state control and party, a little bit of a detail here, what the distribution is. Split is the most common response at the top. Rep is the second most common response, and Dem is the least common response. You've got a lot of missing values here. So this is drawn from, as I said, we've got over 20 years of data that we're interested in. And actually in this particular data set, some of the data goes back even farther to 1960. So there end up being a lot of missing values when we're combining a data set that started in 1960 with a data set that started in the year 2000. But just recognizing that you can get a sense right away of, okay, I've got 4,000 missing. That's a complete rate. That's only full for about a quarter of all the records in this data set. But we think this is a nice way to explore very quickly. Everything on this right-hand side is a link. You can jump right to unemployment, no need to scroll, all that fun stuff. You can go view a missingness report. You can go look at a table to get more tabular details if you want, that you could also export. So there's a whole bunch of fun stuff in here. So let me jump ahead to the next thing. And Lauren, of course, let me know if I'm running too close to our time, but I think I'm about to wrap up right at the mark. So the second thing I wanted to point out was we also have this Git repository. So we were tracking the writing of the code that makes up this big R package, and that lives online. You can review it. And so I call this kind of the third stop, because this is where you can get into some of the data set generation details. So if you go to this website here, you'll be looking at our open to the public Git repository called Knology FinEd State Spending. And you can see there's a little list of folders right down at the bottom. Top folder says R, second folder says data-raw. If you clicked on the data-raw folder, you're then able to go look at each of our each of the files that was used to produce the data sets that you're looking at. So now you're digging really deep under the hood to figure out, okay, is there anything I need to know that's special about this particular data set? So here's just the IRS 990 forms one, where you can see we load in a file that's on Knology's computers. We do a little bit of work here, and that's how we built the file that you could use if you just wanted to use the state year FinEd IRS 990 forms data that's ready for you to go. So again, just wanting to make sure that it's as transparent as possible, that the details of building that data insofar as possible are shared with you. Last thing I wanted to mention, I haven't talked about it a lot so far, is an interactive map that we built. And so this is maybe a last stop, but maybe a first stop for some quick exploration, depending on how you view it. So if you go to this website, you'd be going to a Shiny app that we built, which has a number of fun things coming from the data, but put into this interactive map format where you can see, well, what actually was going on in Colorado in the year 2012, and how does that compare? Very quickly, you get a visual sense of, is that more than or less than the rest of the country? We have all sorts of, kind of extra information on the sidebar here to help you figure out what you're looking at. You can break that down into, on the left-hand sidebar, not just the entire number, but you could say, I want to look at only the public school side or the nonprofit side that I was discussing earlier, and see, okay, how does that look when we're looking only at nonprofits in Idaho? And then we're comparing all the states against each other on the nonprofit number. Similarly, you could be looking at these 4 scales that I was talking about. So here it's highlighting the financial fragility scale. This is, again, interactive. As you move your mouse around, tooltip will just pop up with the value. And so you can get a sense, and you've got some explanation here on the side. For example, that higher numbers indicate respondents would struggle more to navigate financial emergencies. And so you're able to put that in context, but rapidly explore and get a sense of things. You can hit the play button down here if you want to move across years, or you can just slide it around. So we think it's a pretty fun, cool, and useful tool. And lastly, you can do these comparisons over time. And so this is looking at, for example, I just picked 2 states. You can see what's in our data set. You have a nice smooth rise here for Florida. You look like something interesting happened in Alabama. You can look into why that is. But the point is, this could let you compare across states, as well as across different types of intervention, the public school or the nonprofit. And so we think, again, this just offers a really fast way, a cool way to explore the data, think about how you might want to use it. Could it answer the question that you're excited about, and all of that stuff. The very last thing that I wanted to say was, so NEFE originally sponsored Knology to build these data sets, which the work was largely happening in 2020, and recently has done a really fantastic fellowship with 6 fellows. These are fantastic researchers who you'll be able to hopefully see in future webinars what they've been able to do in the fellowship. But it was really nice because as Lauren was saying, there was a leaning toward emerging scholars, but it goes from emerging scholars to assistant professors who are working with this in new ways that I think they hadn't been able to, or hadn't been able to as quickly or as easily, until they were able to make use of some of the things that we had put together. So as I said, we've got fellows who are using those scales that I was talking about. We've got fellows who are using that shed crosswalk to make sure that very quickly they're able to identify which is the variable number that I need to use for the 8 different years of the shed that I'm looking at. We've got fellows using those FinEd spending numbers, and we've got fellows using that economic and demographic data. I think I should say as well, I think we've got some fellows using some of the data that's coming from Urban and Stoddard as well. So it just was a real pleasure to see some really smart people taking this and putting it to the purpose that NEFE and Knology had envisioned when we were starting off in the beginning of the journey. And so NEFE was kind enough to work with Knology again on this, to do this fellowship. And I think, at least from my perspective, it's turned out to be really productive. So I'll finish there. I want to just say thank you for your time. Thanks for joining us here. I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea of what exists in this data set, how you might be able to go taking advantage and profiting from what we've put together to very quickly test out some of your own research ideas. So thank you so much, and I hope you all have a great rest of the day.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joseph. Opening it up for Q&A now. Just a reminder, either raise your hand via Zoom and I'll unmute you to ask your question, or you can put any questions you have in the chat. Any questions? Thank you, Sean, for putting all that in there. There aren't any questions. I'm going to drop that survey link really quick in the chat for your guys' feedback. Thank you, Andrea. Here is that survey link.
Hopefully it's part of, I was thinking part of the reason with there might not be questions. I remember one of our fellows starting off saying like, they just wanted to get their hands dirty with the data and really see what was there and really get a sense of how it could be used. So I hope that at least a few of you also have a similar feeling as some of our fellows who were sort of saying like, I just want to get in there and play around with it and see what it is, and that's when I'm going to figure out what kind of questions I have. And feel free, I think, to rely on the NEFE and the Knology teams if those questions don't come now, but they come later, and we'll do our best to assist.
Yes, definitely. Feel free to reach out to myself or anybody at NEFE, and we can direct your questions as necessary, or also, I'm sure, with Knology. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, I think we'll wrap up a little early. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you, Joseph, for presenting such a great presentation. And like I said, if any other questions come up, don't hesitate to reach out. All right.
Thank you, Lauren.
Dropping off. Have a good day, everybody.